Hey guys, so today I wanted to talk about Afghanistan because it's all over right now. It's what's going on in the world, and there's a lot to unpack. Biden just withdrawed all troops except, you know, he was gonna leave 650 there, but we'll get into that in a minute. Um, so let's go over to the browser. All right. So this is what's going on. $10,000 invested in defense stocks when Afghanistan war began, now worth almost 100,000. So they've essentially multiplied their stocks value by about 10 times what it was originally worth. So if you invested 10K, you would have $100,000 now. If you invested in if you invested evenly amongst America's top 5 defense contractors. If you purchased $10,000 of stock evenly divided among America's top 5 defense contractors on September 18th, 2001, the day President Bush signed the authorization for use of military force in response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and reinvested all dividends faithfully, it would now be worth almost $100,000. That is so much money. That's a lot of money. So, that is, defense stocks outperformed the stock market overall by 58% during the war. So it was more profitable than they thought it would be. I'm sure originally they thought it would be really profitable, which is why they got their fingers all over it. But it actually turned out to be overperforming on the stock market. So if we just go down here, Boeing saw almost 1,000% on their total return. If you purchased 10K in stock in 2001, it would be over $100,000. And it also conveniently lists the board members here. Raytheon had over 330% total return. Lockheed Martin, 1,200% total return. I mean, it's really gross the way that they just basically milked Afghanistan. Took the mineral wealth, took the opium, and basically just used them and then discarded them. Really, they didn't discard them, they discarded us. Biden actually wanted to keep 650 troops in Afghanistan after the withdrawal, but of course, once the Taliban spent 9 days not firing any rounds and still took over the entire country, including Kabul, Biden was forced to give up his 650 permanent troops in Afghanistan. There was also a question about roughly 18,000 service members being kept there, but that also fell through. That was a while ago. The only time that Biden actually spoke about taking those 650 troops out of Afghanistan was the last week when the Taliban just completely blew Joe Biden away, apparently, blew the president away, and took over the whole country without having to fire any guns off, without having to do really anything. It was, I mean, it's pretty incredible, really. So, yeah, they were going to keep all of these people. Of course, they're sending more in. They sent about 5,000 more in, just last week, I believe. So it's not like much is going to be changing. A lot of the troops that were pulled out are getting redirected and redeployed to Syria and Kuwait. So no surprise there. This was just a strategic redirection for U.S. imperialism. Let's continue. There was there was roughly 2,000 people, 2,000 Afghan people, who showed up on the tarmac with their suitcases in hand, and there was this really horrific, sad scene that unfolded at Kabul Airport on the tarmac. Um, People began to grab onto the wheels of the plane, and they actually managed to get into the air, and I believe 7 people fell to their deaths from the plane. Um, I don't really blame them for wanting to escape the Taliban. I mean, how could you? But at the same time, it's really sad. It's a sad sight. It's a sad story. Um, and this is part of the poor handling of the withdrawal by President Biden. It's good. It's a great thing that he withdrew. Let me just get that straight. It's a great thing that the withdrawal happened. We shouldn't have been there in the first place. We'll get to how we got there in the first place a little bit later. But it's just a really poor mishandling of events. The Taliban takeover was inevitable. As Kyle Kalinske put it, it would have happened in 12, 14, 32, 64 years. It wouldn't have mattered. It was always going to become, as Kyle said, Talibanistan or some shit. I don't know. He had a weird ass take on this one too. Praising Biden, saying he was a Biden bro, although, that was satirically, but whatever. Kyle Kalinske also conveniently ignored the 650 troops that were supposed to be put there after the withdrawal, or supposed to stay there after the withdrawal. He conveniently ignored that, as well as his podcast co-host Crystal Ball. She also completely forgot about the 650 troops, and also Sagar and Jetty. So there were also people who actually were gunned down on the tarmac, just shot. That's brutal too. That was really brutal. So I just wanted to add that in, and of course I can't show any of this on YouTube. Even if I could, I probably wouldn't, just for discretion's sake. But so let me show you a tweet. Crying Grim, one of my favorite people on Twitter, honestly, gave this great thread to all of us. He says, "Say what you want about the Taliban, but they've never let refugees climb into the landing gear wheel well of a military plane and then take off before checking it, allowing refugees to fall to their deaths or possibly freeze to death, suffocate to death in flight." I mean, yeah, there should have been much more advisory over that. I mean, it's really... He continues on, and I just couldn't phrase it any better than he possibly could. But, he says, "And yes, I absolutely blame the crewmen operating the aircraft for not doing thorough pre-pushback checks of the vehicle. What if the Taliban had decided to stow away a bomb on board? What if they took down a C-17 full of refugees? Do we even have security in Kabul right now?" This is a great point that he makes. It's so weird to me, and it's so, for lack of a better word, foreign, to have military personnel guarding a plane and trying to push people back, and yet they can't check the wheel wells. They can't, basically give the crew members security while they check the wheel wells. They can't do a proper pre-flight check on the outside of the vehicle. I mean, that's pretty fucking ridiculous if you ask me. Um, he goes on to say, I don't blame the desperate people for climbing on board. I blame the aircrew for not removing those people from the landing gear wheel wells. I blame them for not aborting takeoff, for not securing their vehicle, for not exercising due diligence under exigency. 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 For not exercising due diligence under exigency. He really just continues making great points here. That entire fiasco, the entire situation with people climbing into the wheel well and then falling or jumping, it's pretty gross that they would even let that happen. If you have soldiers there who are armed and they're busy shooting people on the tarmac, but they're not busy protecting crewmen who are doing thorough pre-flight checks, or basically just doing the pre-flight checks themselves, making sure there's no bombs on board, making sure there's no bombs on the wheel wells, making sure that there aren't stowaways on the wheel wells. This is all basic shit. So let's just continue. Great tweets from Crying Grim there. This is part of what I was just talking about. There were 7 killed in the Kabul Airport evacuation, chaos. So thousands of Afghans rushed onto the tarmac at Kabul's international airport Monday, so some desperate to escape the Taliban capture of their country that they held onto an American military jet as it took off and plunged to the death in chaos that killed at least 7 people, U.S. officials said. I have reason to believe that there are more casualties. Of course, 7 just from falling from the wheel well. It seems like they're saying here, but I mean, there were people shot on the tarmac and such, so I mean, I don't think it was 7. I think it was a lot more than 7, but we'll just have to see. The crowds of people rushing the airport came as the Taliban enforced their rule over the wider capital after a lightning advance across the country that took over just a week to dethrone the country's Western-backed government. It's funny because we trained them and then we ran out with our tail between our legs and we thought, no, they'll stay here. As if we didn't train them to run out the second that they could with their tail between their legs. Anyway, the Taliban swept into Kabul on Sunday after President Ashraf Ghani fled the country, bringing an end to a 2-decade campaign in which the U.S. and its allies had tried to transform Afghanistan into a giant crater. The country's Western-trained security forces collapsed or fled ahead of the planned withdrawal of the last American troops at the end of the month. So, one thing that I would really like to touch on here is, what were the original goals of going to Afghanistan? It was to provide the Taliban with no place to go, no place to call their haven, essentially, inside of the country. It was to strengthen their Democratic Party, which turned out to be extremely corrupt. No surprise, because our Democratic Party is also extremely corrupt. But also, it was to catch or kill Osama bin Laden, who was then found in Pakistan. So, basically, mission failed all around. And we continued for 20 years. So, this war has been going on longer than I've been alive. I believe 3 years longer, 2 years longer than I've been alive. This war is finally coming to an end. It's really gross. The amount of civilian casualties is probably the most grotesque thing I've ever seen. and I had no say in it because when it started, I was too young. Of course, I probably would have objected considering my views now, but this is just some thoughts I've had brewing as more people have been talking about it, as I've been interacting and reading and seeing all of this stuff. But speaking of turning the entire country into craters, the U.S. is signaling no change in airstrikes as the Taliban advance. So they're not going to stop. They were actually asking Pakistan if they could hold on to one of their military bases so that they could conduct airstrikes from it. 90% of U.S. airstrikes also have collateral damage, aka kill civilians. I think that's something worth mentioning. The United States showed no sign Monday of stepping up airstrikes in Afghanistan, despite accelerating Taliban gains there. The Pentagon spokesperson emphasized that Americans now see the fight as one for Afghan political and military leaders to win or lose. I think that's absolutely accurate. I'm an isolationist. I've been an isolationist pretty much my entire life. And I've never seen war as a good thing. I've always been more in favor of diplomatic talks, going by international law and such. Of course, there's numerous countries who violate international law, and we don't punish them in any way, even the inhumane ways which we would typically punish any socialist or communist country. Lots of ironic things happening and people saying very ironic things now, especially Marianne Williamson, who we'll wrap this up with. But yeah, so they're not gonna step up the airstrikes, but they're also not going to take them down at all. They're not gonna start, stopping the airstrikes. They're not gonna start winding them down or anything. They're just gonna not increase them. So take that as you will. I mean, it's not good news. It's not bad news. It kind of still is bad news, actually, because they're still airstriking at a country which we have no business in being in. But I'll just go here. This is the tweet that I referenced earlier. Kyle Kalinske says, gradually morphing into a Biden bro, as I see all of political media and every wing of the two major parties go after him for the best thing he ever did. David Williams replies, pop a beer, fire up a joint, but his tweet is cringe. You're saying that after we sent 5,000 additional troops to Afghanistan, Biden said U.S. air support will continue, and that $25 billion in additional war funding is going to private security contractors in the region. So he's saying that Biden is doing an incredible job and that he's fully on board. Biden wanted to keep 650 troops. Biden wanted to keep 650 troops stationed there. Instead, he sent 5,000 back. He said airstrikes and air support will continue. So they're still bombing them. They're still sending troops over there. They're sending more troops over there. And $25 billion in additional war funding is going to private security contractors in the region. That being Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, all of these people who profited, who saw upwards of 10 times their stocks' original values at the beginning of the war. That's who's really winning this. That's who's really winning this. If we want to talk about the blame, who's to blame, which is a really childish thing to talk about, the blame falls on George Bush, first and foremost, for starting the war. He also happened to lie us into other wars. And also, the blame also falls on Biden, secondarily, to Bush, for being a cheerleader for Iraq and Afghanistan back when he was in the Senate. He was one of the biggest cheerleaders for that. And he also, he continued it, he perpetuated it, and he ramped it up during the Obama years. Of course, Trump also increased the bombing level, but he also negotiated a peace deal with the Taliban that was conditions based. So it was actually better than them just pushing us out, especially after Biden wanted to keep 650 troops there, and now he has 5,000 back there. So, whatever, you know. Let's talk about how we got there in the first place. How did we get there in the first place? Give me a sec. Let me get some water. I'm a bit parched, sorry. So how did we get there in the first place? How did we get to Afghanistan? President Carter authorized, I believe it was, let's see, $2 billion. Carter authorized $2 billion to the CIA in order to train and arm the Mujahideen, who wanted to overthrow the socialist government in Afghanistan and wanted to replace them with a democratic government, which was extremely corrupt anyway. This is why the Soviet Union was over there. They were backing the socialist government of Afghanistan, and the Mujahideen, funded by the U.S. on the other side of the Cold War, the Iron Curtain, whatever you would like to call it, were backing the other side. So that's how we started out over there. Operation Cyclone. This is from the New York Times. It's a backlogged, archived, digitized version of the original print. So let's just continue down here to this paragraph. Indeed, Congress was continually prodding the CIA, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the State Department to provide more support for the Afghan guerrillas, being the Mujahideen, who eventually turned into the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. The Afghan guerrillas, who limped along with relatively ineffective weapons until they got Stinger anti-aircraft missiles in September 1986. They used the missiles to shoot down armored Soviet helicopter gunships, and as a result, the guerrillas and their supply caravans have been able to move with much less fear of being attacked from the air. The cost of that armament was $2 billion. As Afghanistan and 3 other nations signed agreements last week providing for the withdrawal of Soviet troops, these details of the supply operation emerged from interviews with members of Congress and officials at the White House, intelligence agencies, the Defense Department, the State Department, and Office of Management and Budget. So here are their points. Number 1, arming the rebels has cost the United States more than $2 billion over 8 years. Keep in mind, this is $2 billion back in 1988, so it's probably a lot more today. More than $2 billion over 8 years to arm the Mujahideen. Although the exact amounts of appropriations are secret because the operation is not officially acknowledged by Washington. Of course, they do this with many things. They did this with Timber Sycamore as well. They did this with many projects, the CIA. Their funding is all extremely under the table, and we have no knowledge of what they do until it's publicly released or there is some sort of whistleblowing happening. The program has had a strong bipartisan support in Congress throughout. That's pretty typical. The government of Saudi Arabia has generally matched the United States' financial contributions, providing money in a joint fund with Washington to buy hundreds of Stingers for the Islamic guerrillas, even though Congress would not permit such sophisticated weapons to be sold to the Saudis themselves. In addition, several wealthy Saudi princes, motivated by a sense of religious duty and solidarity, gave cash contributions to the guerrillas. This is an important point to make. Saudi Arabia treats women extremely poorly extremely poorly, um, pretty much as bad as the Taliban, and yet we still fund them. We still fund their genocide projects like Yemen and such. So I guess when it comes to the U.S., they don't care about Saudi Arabian women and their rights, but they do really, really deeply care about Afghan women's rights, especially Marianne Williamson. She really, really, really cares about women's rights. So um, let's actually talk about Marianne real quick and we'll wrap this up. Marianne says, I understand those who think we should have left Afghanistan. I also understand some of those who think we should have stayed. What I cannot comprehend is anyone minimizing or glossing over the abject terror of 20 million women. I'll say it again. The only people who won here were the defense contractors in the US, being Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Honeywell. As Patricia down there says, they made it worse for women, and they have a chokehold on American foreign policy. So it's really not like any of us had a say. Congress definitely, I mean, most of the wars that are waged today were not brought to Congress in the first place. They were executed using the Gulf of Tonkin resolution as their base. And again, I'll make the same point I just made. Marianne Williamson really cares about women's rights, except when it's Saudi Arabian women. When it's Afghan women, she really, really cares. But when it's Saudi Arabian women, it's a whole different story. Most of the women of color in the global south are the ones who are struggling the most, who are oppressed the most. They're often the ones who are performing a lot of the labor that the rest of the world lives on, especially developed countries. And when I say developed, I really mean countries that weren't oppressed by a giant superpower with a huge military. But they are at the forefront. They're at the forefront of the international movement for labor rights, I feel. So if you care about women's rights, especially in countries where they are extremely limited in their rights, such as Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia, but you aren't willing to actually draw the comparison between U.S. funding of Saudi Arabian genocide and funding of a government in Saudi Arabia who straight up does not care about women's rights, but you are willing to criticize the Taliban for their treatment or mistreatment of women. Well, that's, you're kind of contradicting yourself. You either care about women's rights or you don't. You can't just go around saying that you care about it, but not in this country. Oh, we can keep supporting them. I don't care about Saudi Arabia. They're only our biggest ally in the region. This is the ridiculous shit that people say, and it's really infuriating to look at this kind of stuff. I'll scroll through, and I mean, she's really just, I can't say she's getting ratioed, but she is really, see Patricia here again. The U.S. considers Saudi Arabia as its closest ally, or Dubai and the UAE, United Arab Emirates, where that princess keeps escaping and surveillance tracks them down, all U.S. BFFs. It's totally true. Um, the point is, you can't say that you support Afghan women's. Um, you can't say that you genuinely support women's rights around the world if you are going to criticize a single nation in a region which has a doctrine of not affording women rights, but then also not criticize the U.S.'s allyship with a country that treats women pretty much just the same. Um, go up and read this again. I understand those who think we should have left. I also understand some of those who think we should have stayed. What I cannot comprehend is anyone minimizing or glossing over the abject terror of 20 million women. Marianne, why are you glossing over the abject terror of all the women in Saudi Arabia? Or all the women in Yemen? I mean, really, like, you want people to not gloss over 20 million women's abject terror, in your own words, but at the same time, you're willing to gloss over the abject terror of the U.S.'s greatest allies, women. It's really just ridiculous, the kind of shit that these people say. Anyway, so this war has been going on longer than I've been alive. I've quite literally lived through the entire thing, not start to finish. And it's just dragged on for too long. Shouldn't have been there in the first place. We were meddling in another government. We were trying to catch people who weren't there. It's ridiculous that we stayed after we caught Osama in Pakistan. It's ridiculous we stayed pretty much at all once we realized, or once they realized, rather, what they were going up against with the Taliban. They thought they would be able to wipe them out very quickly. Instead, they just pushed them back very quickly and bombed the shit out of a bunch of civilians, which created more Taliban members. So it's really just cyclical violence. It's gross. It's imperialist. Afghanistan was pretty much pillaged of all of its opium when the U.S. took advantage of the opium trade, also sapping it of its extremely valuable rare earth minerals. So that's pretty much my thoughts. I just wanted to weigh in, and I will see you guys next time.